But here, we can also talk about conventional nature of the mind. What is the conventional nature of the mind? Is that the mind is clear and knowing. That's the conventional nature of the mind. And so, we come to see this in shamatha. We come to see this in vipassana. So what's being described here, the fusion of stillness and movement, is this. Is that through doing shamatha practice, this becomes very obvious, and we come to see that thoughts are nothing other than this. So it's not a vipassana in terms of investigating how thoughts exist. We're just coming to see that they have the same conventional nature as the mind itself.
So this is the gross mind.
No, I mean, also here, when we achieve shamatha, we're seeing this. You know, remember the three qualities in shamatha is clarity, non-conceptuality, bliss. The mind of shamatha is already a much more subtle mind. You wouldn't really call it coarse.
And the other question is, I was taught that you were spoken about two aspects of the mind that we practice shamatha on. For the shamatha, the object, the stillness and the thoughts.
Oh, the two different...
Not the stillness, no, sorry. The thoughts and the awareness.
The two variations.
Yeah.
Either the observing the mind or resting in awareness. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
There isn't a third one, which is the stillness of the mind.
The stillness of the mind is resting in awareness.
This is the knowing mind, no?
But the knowing mind and the mind you're resting in is the same mind. It's not like there's one mind here and another one here, is there? You don't have two minds. So when we rest in awareness, as said here, whether we're resting in awareness or we're observing thoughts, when we're resting in awareness, we because we're focusing on awareness itself, we notice the stillness immediately. When we're observing thoughts, all we notice is this. And then slowly, as the amount of thoughts die down, we notice that. So in this practice, observing the mind, we can talk about the space of the mind and everything that appears in that space, but now all we see is movement. So that's a little bit like, the analogy often used here is like the mind is like the sky, and the thoughts are like the clouds moving through the sky. So now, this is like completely clouded over. It's just clouds. Thick. Here, a little bit of break, but mostly very cloudy with a few little bits of... So already what's peeking through is this. So already here, we are starting to see this in the little breaks in the clouds. Here, more breaks in the clouds, and of course in that break is stillness. So we're seeing more stillness here, but still there's a lot of movement. But then eventually that movement, the clouds disappear, and you just have a crystal clear blue sky. So then you are observing that space of the mind, and there's no movement, it's stillness. This is what's being said here. Now, observing that stillness, is that different from resting in awareness? No. Same practice. Same experience. Experientially, it feels a bit different. Experientially, if we're looking at the mind, we have a stronger sense of being a separate observer. I'm observing thoughts, emotions, memories. And if there's none there, I am observing that stillness, that space of the mind. So experientially seems like duality, it seems like a separate observer. Whereas the practice we just did before, resting in awareness, experientially, there's not a strong sense of being a separate observer, because we're not doing, we're being. So in the practice we just did, in this practice, observing thoughts, we are observing the sky and any clouds moving through the sky. And as we do that, the clouds eventually disappear and we see the blue sky. But in the practice we just did, the resting in awareness, it's about being the sky. rather than observing the sky. It's the same sky, but experientially it feels a bit different. But of course, the closer we get to shamatha, the more that they will experientially be the same, because we'll end up in that stillness, that non-conceptual experience. So regardless of whether approach we use, or even using the breath or any other object, we all come down to the same exact experience in shamatha.
So actually, I think you just answered my question with your
I hope so.
sentence. The last sentence, because when I, for example, when I do anapanasati, then I would say at least in the first year that I've done it, like when I got into more stages of stillness,
Yeah.
because of the
Stillness, you mean no thoughts coming up? Or,
right?
Yeah.
But then, like, there was this memory coming up that, oh, you have to stick to the instructions. So you're observing the breath again. So when you said that eventually it emerges into this awareness, like the third practice,
Yeah.
even if you observe the breath or the mind, then eventually like that, is it when I'm already there, do I go back?
Yeah,
or
but
is it
no. I mean, this merging happens up here,
right?
not down here.
Right.
So down here, if the mind goes still, and you're supposed to be observing the breath, and then you're somehow not observing the breath and you're resting in stillness, you've got distracted. Because your object is the breath.
Right.
So then you need to go back to the breath. Unless, of course, you want to just practice shamatha in the stillness, which is also okay, but if you just keep moving backwards and forwards, you're not going to progress.
I want to avoid that, but I'm saying that avoiding that is knowing that
Avoiding...
it's gonna end up in awareness, and I'm not supposed to go back.
Back? Well, it's not back or forward or
Not
back.
but I'm saying back to the instructions
Yeah.
of watching the breath, because
Sure.
I can see that the beginning of the thought of focusing again on the breath is coming up, and I could unidentify with it.
You mean unidentify or unfocus?
Unidentify with
Well,
the
we're not
thought.
supposed to identify with anything in any shamatha practice, of course.
Even though the initial instruction is to observe the...
To observe, but that doesn't mean... Identify means is caught up.
Right.
So we're not identifying with the breath or mind or anything, we're just observing whatever the object is. Identification is grasping, is distraction.
So, okay, so maybe focusing on the breath.
Right. So
The thought
if...
of, I can see that the thought of going back focusing on the breath is emerging again, then I can unidentify with it and let it pass.
But that's your object, so you should focus on it.
That's what I'm asking.
You're right, yes. So again, what will happen is, whether we're using the breath, the mind, awareness, any object, those three qualities, clarity, non-conceptuality, bliss, will start coming up, regardless of what we're focusing on. But I think what you're describing maybe is that something like this is coming up, maybe the stillness, and we go, oh, that's nice, and we're resting in that. But then we're caught up in that experience. We're not doing shamatha practice. So rather, if stillness comes, use that still mind to focus better on the breath. Use that clarity to focus better on the breath. Use that bliss to focus better on the breath. Whatever the object is, so don't keep shifting around.
Right, so if
you want to, and that's what sometimes Alan Wallace in his book recommends, is in these initial stages, the first few stages when our mind is completely chaotic, and you're trying to observe the mind, you may find it's just impossible to get into the practice. We're just swept away all the time, and we get disheartened because we can't even start the practice. So then what we can do is go to the breath, because it's a bit easier. Use the breath for, say, the first 4 stages, but this could take weeks or months or years of practice. Once we get sort of to these middling stages, stage 4, we can focus on the breath without ever completely losing it. Now when our mind is more stable and clear, now we can consciously switch to observing the mind or resting in awareness. But then from then on, in every one of our practices, we're not focusing on the breath, we're focusing on the mind or resting in awareness. We keep the practice with that. keep going. That's fine. But in the meditation, moving backwards and forwards is a little bit counterproductive.
What I understood from your word is that in a later stage, we're not even focusing on the breath anymore.
Later stage is shamatha.
Right.
One more point on that is, as we go along these stages and our focus becomes better and better and better, you'll find that the sense faculties will start to shut down. And so, particularly in the Theravada traditions, they say if you're using the breath, what's going to happen is you'll need to move to what's called the acquired sign. This is often described in the Theravada traditions, which means that, and it's not a fixed point, it depends on the person, but at some point, what's going to happen, if you're using the breath as the object, you'll find that this acquired sign will appear, which is a mental image relating to the breath. It's not something you generate, it spontaneously arises due to the fact you've gone deeper into the practice. When this appearance comes, and it can appear as a cloud, a cobweb, a star, puff of smoke, it can appear in many different ways depending on the individual practitioner. When this appears, you shift from the physical sensations of the breath to that, and you keep that as your object the rest of the way, because your sense faculties will shut down, which means you're not going to be able to notice the breath in the higher levels of the practice. But still, it's still called anapanasati. It's still mindfulness of breathing because you're focusing on this mental image which is related to the breath. So you use that the rest of the way to shamatha.
I have a question. You said that focus on an object that works best for you.
Correct.
Now, the answer a little bit confused me, because as a beginner, is it to practice like starting with breathing and then switching to the mind is not
Okay.
that's all.
Yeah. So the general recommendation is use the object that works best for you. That doesn't necessarily mean the one that's easiest. Because perhaps, for most of us here, the breath is the easiest. But maybe we find that quite uninteresting, quite boring.
Yeah.
Then, if we find it boring, it's not going to work. Because we're not interested. We need to be enthusiastic about the practice. And if we're not enthusiastic about the breath is not the best object for us. Either we shift that and become enthusiastic, or we pick another object that we are enthusiastic. So maybe we're not very enthusiastic about the breath and we can't get enthusiastic, but we're very enthusiastic about observing the mind or resting in awareness, but we find it very difficult. Then maybe that's the object we need to use.
Yeah.
Because we're enthusiastic. Okay, it's difficult, but we're enthusiastic. We need enthusiasm, otherwise we're not going to go anywhere. So then we can use that. Another option, which I mentioned here, is, so the recommendation, pick an object that works and then use that the whole time.
Okay.
Or another option, which Alan Wallace suggests, is that, again, if we want to use the mind or rest and awareness and we really find it impossible to even begin, we could start with the breath, work with that until sort of around stage 4, and this could be weeks, months or years. When the mind is more stable and clear, then we can switch to the mind or awareness and get into the practice and then continue with that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also possible, but 1 week this, 1 week that,
Yeah, that's not our recommendation.
it's not really, I mean, as a beginner, what can be helpful is spend some time learning each of these practices. So maybe we spend a couple of weeks or a month learning the breath, a couple of weeks or a month doing the mind, a couple of weeks or a month doing the awareness. Because probably we'll need about that amount of time to really see if it's a practice. I mean, if we just do it 2 or 3 times, I think that's not a fair indication whether this is something for us. We need to give it a fair trial. So, you know, a few weeks or a month of doing that practice every day, then after a month, maybe we can go, okay, this is something I can maybe would like to use.
Yeah, what I found that like keeps the enthusiasm in is just like, because if I'm doing like 10 minutes, 15 minutes breath, and then like there's a gong and I'm switching to focusing on the mind or awareness, then it gives me motivation also with the breath.
Correct,
Have a
but
better-
then you're using the
but
breath
then-
as a preparation
Yeah,
for that. So that's
because
okay. That's okay. You can use the breath as a preparation to move on to that. That's fine, but we're not, you know, doing this. We're not sort of then doing the mind and then, oh, let's switch back to the breath and go to this and that.
No,
No, that's okay. Okay, time for afternoon tea break. So let's have a tea break. Come back at 3:15 for the last session, and then there's some more points there in the shamatha we need to cover. So let's take a tea break first. Come back at 3:15.